All right, hitting record. So this is going to be available for people afterward. Welcome everybody. I'm Chad Koulis, Executive Director of the Midway Chamber of Commerce. And you may have been on our call. We had two calls early on in this. We had one the day the PPP loans became available, and then we had one week later when people could ask their initial questions after applying for the PPP. And those were with David Riling, the CEO from Sunrise Banks. So it's fitting that our moderator today is Chris Albrecht and that our sponsor is Sunrise Banks. And I want to get us into the program because I have a feeling we're going to have a lot of questions. So I'm just going to remind everybody that you should keep yourself on mute unless you are the one speaking. And also, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we're going to get to as many of them as we can. So I will turn it over to our moderator and sponsor, Chris Albrecht.
Thank you, Chad. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see virtually everyone. It feels like an episode of the Brady Bunch as everyone starts popping up and the little boxes, squares come on. I would ask if you could introduce yourself in chat and tell us where you're from, your industry, any comments that you have. Please direct those to all panelists and participants, and we'll watch those and try to get those questions directed to our panelists. Chad had mentioned the last time we got together to talk about PPP was when the PPP program opened, and I was wondering, you know, it seems like we've been at this forever. So I did a quick calculation to see how long it really has been. So April 3rd is when we opened up and did our first loan. It's been 153 days. It seems like forever, I know. If we go in minutes, it's over 13 million minutes, 5 months. And the metric that really made me go, wow, was it's 41.8% of 2020. Since we started doing PPP loans. It feels like that's all we've been doing. So good morning, I'm Chris Albrecht. I'm the Director of SBA Lending for Sunrise Banks. Sunrise, we are pleased to be an advance sponsor. We're a preferred lender. We are a B Corp that believes in taking care of our community. We believe that's our social responsibility. We're an active PPP loan lender. We've originated over 1,800 loans for over $215 million. And in line with the SBA statistics, over 80% of our loans were under $150,000 in size. And nearly 50% were under $25,000. So we really were hitting our mission of taking care of our community and reaching the small businesses and the owners that were so greatly impacted. So I'd like to introduce our guest joining us for this discussion. Brian McDonald from the Minnesota District Office of the SBA. Brian is the current District Director of the Minnesota District Office of the Small Business Administration. In his role, he manages the strategic efforts and daily operations of SBA's small business support throughout the states. Brian spent 5 years with SBA's Office of Entrepreneurial Development in Washington. In addition to his experience with the SBA, Brian served on the President's Management Council as a policy analyst at Health and Human Services, and he served with the U.S. Department of Treasury's CDFI fund. And Brian has private banking experience. Also joining us is Kevin Sullivan of Sullivan Consulting. Kevin is a CPA specializing in small business accounting and tax matters and has over 15 years of experiences with his firm. He consults on a variety of business matters, including the PPP program. He does business planning and succession and tax matters. Kevin is also an expert in business valuation appraisals. So I'd like to open up with some remarks from Brian McDonald. Brian, we are honored to have you with us this morning. I know that you're a pretty busy guy with everything going on with PPP lending. There have been a lot of changes, Brian. Continued changes with the program since it's opened. Can you give us a roll-up of what updates that you've seen and what we can expect?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Chad and Chris, for the opportunity to come back to the group today and talk about how small businesses make the most of the Payroll Protection Program, PPP, at today's meeting. And I know, Chris, we were just on a roundtable last week together, so it's great to be with you again, and thank you for everything you're doing. And so the SBA, I would say, used to be one of the best kept secrets in the federal government, but those days are definitely long gone. And so we were created in 1953. And so the U.S. Small Business Administration, I'm a federal employee, as Chris said, in the district office here in Minnesota. And we're the only independent branch of the federal government dedicated to helping small businesses start, grow, expand, and recover. So we're a small agency with a big mission, and we have many resource partners helping us accomplish that. So our team does cover the state of Minnesota, and we provide training for small business owners and work with our resource partners, who also provide counseling and training. And we primarily work to help lenders utilize SBA-backed loans for their clients. So since March, our agency and office, we've been working really hard to help our nation deal with the current crisis, including by administering with Treasury the PPP program. So also I wanted to note, given this is the Midway Chamber, is that lately our team has been focused on recovery efforts for businesses harmed during civil unrest. And specifically last week, we were doing a big outreach push for our civil unrest disaster loan directly from SBA. So that's a direct loan program for businesses with uninsured or underinsured losses or facing economic injury. But today I'm going to focus, and I'd be happy to answer any questions on the civil unrest program. But of course, we're going to focus on PPP Forgiveness. And so just a couple updates. Lenders in Minnesota, so this is Minnesota specific, got out 102,000 PPP loans into the hands of businesses. And that was nearly $11.4 billion in PPP loans that helped keep Minnesotans employed. So as we move forward, most businesses at this point have spent those funds and are now looking for loan forgiveness. So that's why we're here today. And the SBA is working closely with the lending community to help move this forward. So just a couple of points on PPP forgiveness guidelines, some of which was changed by Congress after the last presentation on this subject to the Chamber and the initial rollout of the program. So I think it's important to cover some of these. So in June, the PPP Flexibility Act was passed, which amended the rules in order to receive 100% full forgiveness on your PPP loan. So borrowers now need to spend 60% on payroll costs during a 24-week period. Previously, it was reduced to 60% from 75% on payroll, and there is only an 8-week covered period. So also, it spelled out certain safe harbors for businesses that were unable to maintain full-time equivalent employees, and for businesses unable to rehire previous or similarly qualified employees. So again, that's why it was called the Flexibility Act. That was passed in June. That changed some of the policy on forgiveness and other factors for PPP. So I would encourage everyone on the call to visit sba.gov/PPP for more details. And if you have specific questions, mostly I think all of the forms are on that site. I'll put it in the chat so everyone has it. And I think as we reference certain docs, I'll make sure to send those to Chad for any follow-up with the group. But just to summarize, before I kick it back to you, Chris, PPP was closed on August 8th. So there's no new PPP loans going out at the moment. Again, there is 102,000 in Minnesota for 11.3 billion. And there is over 130 billion nationally, 130 billion remaining in PPP funds right now. So those funds are sitting in the SBA bank account. So at this point, businesses and lenders are shifting focus to forgiveness while paying attention to any change from Congress due to additional stimulus and potential repurposing of the remaining funds and any potential changes. So it's important to work with your lender that you received your PPP loan through, and you'll submit your forgiveness application through your lender. Some lenders have automated systems. Some are accepting paper applications only. So I think a theme that you'll hear today is to keep the lines of communication open with your lender and see what they're doing. So Chris, I will turn it back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Brian, for your comments and your information and updates. And we look forward to hearing more. And we appreciate all that you and your staff are doing to help our small businesses in our community. And we know it's an extremely busy time. So thank you again for making time for us this morning for this call. I'd also like to welcome Kevin Sullivan. Kevin is a chamber member and a CPA. Kevin, would you like to give us an update from your lens on what you're seeing from the accounting side with businesses?
Well, it's you know, an interesting time. A lot of people asking for some help and guidance and research, that type of thing. But in terms of, you know, really where we sit now with trying to going through the process of the loan forgiveness application, I think businesses have a few options to maybe consider. First off, if you're, let's say, a sole practitioner and you don't have any accounting staff, obviously, I guess one option would be for you to take the time to learn the rules and work with your banker or others to know what has to go in the forgiveness application form. If you have an accounting staff or accounting outsourced person, and you want to rely on them, just make sure that they're up to speed with the rules and the information required, and possibly go that route. Another option would be if you either don't have the time or interest or want to spend your time on other priorities, you could hire an outside consultant to assist you with the process with completing the form and the application for loan forgiveness. However, understanding that ultimately you still have the responsibility for the information and the data, since it's your company's loan. So options for consultants would be your own existing accounting firm or another outside consultant. Another resource too, in terms of maybe more cost effective, there's an organization of volunteers called, and perhaps you've heard of it, called SCORE, which is consists of retired executives that volunteer their time to assist small businesses, and you can possibly get some assistance through them. Their website is www.score.org. And if you'd like, I can give you an email of the local person in the St. Paul office for SCORE as well. And they assist with not just loan application assistance, but also other matters, marketing, strategy, that type of thing.
That's great.
Yeah.
Great. Kevin, are you finding that you've got a number of clients coming in right now? Are they at the point of asking for forgiveness?
Right, yes. Well, quite a few in terms of the initial, you know, those that applied early, received the loans before June 5th, I believe it was, and are using the 8-week window for doing the application. There's two alternatives: to either use an 8-week window or a 24-week window. But yes, quite a few are deciding to, you know, do the application as soon as they can and kind of get it behind them and work on it as soon as they can, which is probably a good advice too, just to get the process rolling.
Sure. Brian, the SBA has opened their forgiveness portal. It's been open a couple of weeks now. Can you give us any insight on how many loans have been submitted through the portal, and have loans been forgiven at this point?
Yeah, so lenders are slowly starting to submit applications to SBA through that forgiveness platform that opened just a couple days after PPP ended. And so once received, so once you submit your application to your lender, the lender has 60 days to submit it to SBA through this portal. And then SBA has 90 days to approve and remit payment directly to the lender. Of course, I think we're all hoping we can get it done faster than that. I know we are hearing that the portal is working at this point, and we're still awaiting data on the numbers processed from the agency. So my understanding is it's not publicly reported yet. But according to the lenders roundtable that our team hosted last week, We're aware that several local lenders have started the process, but certainly it's been slow so far. And I think, you know, one of the things we wanted to point out is that folks have 10 months to submit that forgiveness application after their covered period ends. So I think, you know, just want to emphasize, I know everyone who's on this call today obviously is on the ball and wants to make sure we're all doing this right. And I think it's in everyone's interest for everything to be forgiven. But I did just want to point out that there is that time that we still have. And it's not as much of, I think we're all kind of in that crunch panic mode with on the front end of PPP and making sure we all got the loans approved with the deadline. But I think the forgiveness part, at least, there's more time on that forgiveness. So I just wanted to point that out, Chris. So I don't have specific numbers yet on process.
Sure. Thanks for pointing that out, Brian. That's one thing for sure with PPP. It's thrown out a lot of numbers. It feels like every time you pick up, there's another number, and it's easy to get confused on which numbers, which dates, which time periods we need to spend most attention to. So knowing that 10-month deferral period from the point of receipt of funds based on the election period for forgiveness, that's a great metric to reaffirm that we don't need to do anything today or tomorrow or in the next 30 days. We do have customers watching it very closely. They are concerned about making sure they follow the guidelines, and this is very helpful. Brian, we've heard in media and other sources that there's discussion about wholesale forgiveness of PPP loans. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What size? How likely do you see this coming to fruition?
All right, so yeah, that's definitely the $1 million or the $150,000 question, and I'm joking. So right now, per the statute, PPP forgiveness is based on utilizing the funds primarily for payroll, regardless of what size PPP loan you received. So again, as long as you use, no matter what size PPP loan you use, the current statute says as long as you use 60% on payroll, the whole thing would be forgiven. And so I know I've been talking personally to the full spectrum size of businesses who have received PPP, from just a couple $1,000 PPP loans. And even just in the last week or two, I've talked to folks who've received a $10 million PPP loan. So right now, all PPP borrowers at this time would need to submit a forgiveness application through your lender unless anything changes with the rules from Congress.
That sounds great. Do you think, Brian, that when we close the PPP round this time, and much to everyone's surprise, we didn't run out of money in 48 hours like we originally thought when we opened up the second round and worked around the clock. Do we think there'll be another round of PPP funding opening up?
So there is, I mentioned, a lot of funds remaining right now. Over 130 billion is still in the account for PPP. And there's definitely a lot of discussions with that much money on repurposing. All of it at the moment is just speculation because there isn't any legislation. So one potential thing we've heard just even last week was that there could be an executive order from the president to reopen PPP, given the logjam that's currently in Congress. So there's potential for that. But we've heard, there's a lot of things kicking around in Congress on the Hill as well. So there might be some potential to assist smaller businesses with PPP. So to reopen, I think certainly to reopen PPP, but then the conversation is, should that just be available to smaller businesses or certain industries, particularly hard hit, like the hospitality industry, restaurants, music venues? I know there's a Save Our Stages bill that was introduced for independent music venues. So our top official visited the Twin Cities a couple weeks back and heard directly from Chad from the chamber, and also a lot of businesses here about the unique conditions here in Minnesota. So I do feel good that our perspective has been shared up the chain at high levels, at least, as those conversations occur. And again, PPP did close August 8th. So I do think it will reopen, but it's TBD.
Great, that's good to know, Brian. We had a question come in through chat asking if it would be possible to reopen for a second opportunity for a PPP loan, coming from one of our members affiliated with a nonprofit. So the nonprofit world has been one space that otherwise we haven't lent to in the SBA world, and it's been much needed funds to those organizations. And so it is a possibility. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I think that's what's under consideration right now, would be how to open it back up so folks could get a second PPP loan, maybe, again, specific to smaller businesses, or maybe more need-based, or based on types of industry. One other consideration might be for location, for those who are located in downtowns, which are particularly hard hit. So I think there's a lot of proposals kicking around, so we'll just kind of wait and see what happens. But there's certainly, the funding, there is funding remaining, so we're hoping it's going to get repurposed, hopefully pretty soon.
That's great. And just to clarify too, when we talked about the change from 75% for forgiveness for payroll, and then it was reduced to 60%, if a business would elect to use 100% for payroll, that would still be between the lines, correct? That would still be forgivable. They don't have to use 60%. It's just a minimum of 60%.
Yeah, so there is partial forgiveness, and I think it kind of makes sense, and you can kind of see the mechanics of that when you look at the forgiveness application. And so yeah, there is a line, I think it might be line 7 or line 6, where you go in there on the form, and it helps you calculate, okay, let's say you only use 50% for payroll, but use the other 50%. You have to use 100% for eligible uses of PPP, and there's four eligible uses. But let's say you use less than 60% on payroll, you could still get a good chunk of the loan forgiven. And then of course, if it's not forgiven, then you would kind of look at what the loan promissory note was with your lender, and if it's a two-year loan at that point for any remaining balance, or a 5-year note with, again, 1% interest.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you for everyone for putting in your questions in chat. We are watching those. If you have any questions you'd like us to ask the panel, please put those in and type them into everyone, and we'll watch that and hopefully get answers to what you're dying to know. Kevin, customers right now, what should they be doing at this stage in anticipation of forgiveness? Let's say they haven't, they're not ready for forgiveness yet, but what steps should they be taking now to be ready? What type of information should they be gathering?
I'll give you, can I share a screen and go
Certainly.
over some information on that? Let's see if I can.
Sure.
Click the right button here. Let's see. Are you able to see that at all, or no?
Yes.
So does it say PPP Self-Employed Loan Forgiveness? And
Yeah.
Yeah. Second. So this is an outline provided by the American Institute of CPAs, and it'll walk us through perhaps a little too much detail, but I'll try to cover it as broadly as I can here without getting too bogged down. First example here is for a self-employed person with an individual that's filed a Schedule C, and this would not apply to a corporation or an S Corp or a partnership. But I'll run through this example just for those who are self-employed. So I'm going to give you a flavor for some of the information that should be gathered and available in order to complete the loan application, for loan forgiveness application form. So you want to track the total eligible costs that are incurred during the period that, in this example, is using the 8-week period for the loan forgiveness period. And So a lot of this information is going to come from your accounting system. A lot of small businesses use QuickBooks. As long as, I guess the key thing is to keep that up to date and have it be complete. And what you'll need to have available would be owner's compensation, which is the first item. And there's a lot of detail here in terms of how much you can include in the loan forgiveness application form. Certain things qualify for eligible expenses. Mortgage interest does on real estate, and there's certain caveats, like you have to have had the mortgage prior to February 15th. And then it's limited to the amount that was actually claimed or deducted on your Schedule C for 2019. Likewise, rent and lease payments, similar. Any agreements that were in effect prior to March 15th, 2020, that rent expense can be claimed as a qualifying expense on the loan application form. And then certain utility expenses, electricity, gas, water, and so forth, they still have that caveat in there about having had those types of services prior to that March 15th date. But kind of panning down, that first page we covered was for self-employed people without employees. The second page kind of recaps for self-employed individuals that do have employees. The key difference being the payroll costs that you're able to include is part of the eligible expenses. And those include things such as, I guess, obviously salaries and wages, tips, payment for leave, separation allowances, if there's any of those, housing allowance or stipends, healthcare benefits and group health coverage. Retirement benefits are also included, so any retirement contribution you're making, such as to a SEP for yourself or for employees, that would be an eligible expense. And any state and local taxes that are assessed on compensation. I should point out too, a lot of if you're using a payroll service, a lot of this information they've captured in their reporting too, so it should make it easier to come up with the numbers that you need. The mortgage and interest payments are eligible expenses similar to the self-employed individual without employees. So basically gathering all those expenses and summarizing it for the loan forgiveness application form. And then there's another calculation for determining whether or not the payroll was reduced more than 25% during the previous full quarter prior to the application. And the reason for that being that if it has been, then a portion of any amount that's more than the 25% reduction reduces the loan forgiveness amount. And likewise, not to further complicate things a little bit, but there's a full-time equivalent sort of test or provision too, where if you have employees that if the full-time equivalent amount of your employment decreased more than a certain amount, that could potentially reduce the amount of forgiveness too. So what you need to do then is determine or calculate any adjustments because of the full-time equivalents and the salary wages weren't restored by June 30th. Determine if that's the case. So in many cases, it doesn't apply, but you need to determine whether or not it does. And then there's a calculation for the payroll cost forgiveness floor, which is part of the application. And then just a reminder on some things too, like salaries more than $100,000 are not included as part of the eligible expenses. And any employees that are not U.S. residents, those salaries are excluded. independent contractor payments are not treated as wages, so they're excluded as well. So any independent contractor payments or any benefits for independent contractors are not included. I don't know how prevalent this is. Chris, you might be able to give us an idea, but some lenders may have required that the proceeds be put in a separate bank account, and I think the intent there was to try to just have it be segregated. I haven't seen that.
Right.
And then also there's the application itself was released on May 15th. The AICPA, and I don't know whether or not, whether Brian, the SBA has like on the application, if they have like a loan forgiveness calculator, but there is a resource that the AICPA has published an Excel spreadsheet that captures all this information that's needed for the loan application. And I can provide that to people if they want to have that as well. It's kind of a multi-tab document that captures all the information that's needed for the application form. Does that pretty much covers that for now? Does that help?
It does. Wow, Kevin. Well, it reaffirms the reason for the getting together today and talking about this. There's a lot of twists and turns. There's a lot of questions to ask. There's a lot of information to gather. And we've seen a lot of changes come through. So we've seen, for instance, the 75% payroll has been reduced down to needing 60%. You can use more for other eligible expenses. So it is a work in process, figuring out and navigating the PPP forgiveness piece. For borrowers, the message I would guess would be to continue to document your information, your payroll expenses, your other eligible expenses, and at that point when you're ready to apply for forgiveness, utilize resources such as your accountant or other resources you may have, your lending institution, to help make sure that you're able to apply for maximum forgiveness. So Kevin, can I ask you a question? We've been seeing this with borrowers, and because again, we've been at this for 5 months, business continues. Is there a tax event with PPP forgiveness? Are borrowers going to receive a tax bill if their PPP loan is forgiven?
Yeah, there's been some concern about that too. Where it currently stands is that the amount of the loan forgiveness is not considered non-taxable income. And so that's good news. The expenses that are associated with getting you to that point or qualifying for the loan forgiveness, those are also non-deductible. So theoretically, if you have the proceeds that's totally forgiven and you spent the exact same amount to achieve that, then there's no taxable event or there's no taxable income generated by that. It's potentially where you have a difference in spending less of eligible expenses lower than the forgiven amount, which I don't know how often that would occur, but it's possible. Then you would have potentially lower expenses that are not deductible, but you'd still have the loan forgiveness amount that's non-taxable. And my understanding too is that Minnesota conforms to that same treatment, so which is good news.
Hey, Kevin, can I ask, so some of the non-payroll expenses that would qualify under PPP, those, if you use those for PPP, then they can't also be deducted, right?
Correct, right. And it's similar to, well, the definition of eligible expenses is I think pretty similar to the tax definition of ordinary and necessary business expenses, except for only certain expenses are defined or eligible for the loan forgiveness, which we covered a little bit earlier.
Great, great. In the chat, we are receiving requests for the slides that were put up, and the answer is yes, we can make those slides available after the webinar, any of the information. Additionally, Brian has been posting some resources for the SBA and Treasury for other resources. Those are updated, and again, everything changes, so that would be our source for most updated information. Brian, I have a question for you regarding what happens to a PPP loan if a business receives a PPP loan and they decide to sell their business to another business that has a PPP loan as well?
Yeah, so in a change of ownership, right now it's preferred that the borrower wait until the PPP loan is forgiven to finalize the sale. So a PPP borrower may sell their business during the period when the PPP loan is outstanding and before forgiveness has been granted. But in this case, proceeds of the sale in an amount equaling the outstanding PPP loan balance, we're recommending they be placed in escrow with the PPP lender to cover the outstanding balance of the PPP loan if it isn't forgiven. So further, if the change of ownership is funded with an SBA loan, the loan must be processed non-delegated. We do not review purchase agreements. So Chris, you can probably maybe translate that for everyone, but we do anticipate that a procedural notice will be issued in the near future, going out to lenders from SBA as well on this topic.
Okay, Brian, so just so I understand right, so
yeah.
Am I hearing then that if we have a business for sale and that business has a PPP loan and an existing business is buying it that has a PPP loan, it's not that we can't do the loan with SBA financing, but we need to send it in to the SBA for them to approve the loan?
Right, so it says, yeah, the loan must be processed non-delegated.
Correct, which means, delegated would be delegated authority. PPP authority would mean there are lenders that decision on behalf of the SBA for SBA loans. And there are some instances where that decision needs to be made directly by the SBA versus being made on behalf of the SBA at the lending institution. So got it. I'll wait for that update. Yeah, that will answer that question.
It's definitely a really good question. And I think you can see that there is complexity there. So that just shows the value of having that open door with your lender to really be able to talk that through with them. And obviously it is a consideration that it's preferred probably to wait until the PPP loan is forgiven to finalize the sale at this point.
Got it. Perfect. Brian, could you talk a little bit about how we would treat idle loans in the forgiveness process? That seems to be a gray area for a lot of people.
Yeah, so the idle loan portion really won't affect PPP here in Minnesota, the loan portion, because we really didn't have too many idle loans issued here in Minnesota prior to April 3rd. So if anyone, you were eligible to get an economic injury disaster loan, which we call EIDL, and that was a program direct from SBA versus PPP, which is through your lender. Now, there is an interplay right now between the EIDL advance and PPP forgiveness. So EIDL was the program, again, that was direct from SBA, and there was the EIDL loan, but also there under the CARES Act, we also had the EIDL advance, which was a grant portion made available under the CARES Act. Now let's say, and that EIDL advance was up to $10,000, depending on the number of employees that you had at your company. So if you had 10 or more employees at your company and you applied for an EIDL loan from SBA, you got what's called an EIDL advance. So that was a it was basically a grant from the SBA. Now, because of some of the statutory rules with the CARES Act, that EIDL advance portion is currently tied to your PPP forgiveness. So let's say you have a $100,000 PPP loan and you got a $10,000 idle advance. So right now, what will happen based on the current rules, unless there's a change in Congress, and this is something that Congress is certainly aware of and looking into, I've heard in terms of maybe some policy changes to PPP, but as the rules currently stand, let's say you have a $100,000 PPP loan and a $10,000 idle advance. What will happen is when you submit your forgiveness application to your lender, let's for 100,000, and they look at it, they submit it to SBA. SBA would only be able to pay 90,000 to the lender because of that $10,000 idle advance that you received.
Mm-hmm.
And based on the statute, we're not allowed to go beyond that full $100,000 forgiveness amount. So those are the rules as they currently stand, and it's really a good point to bring up and to be aware of as you're going through forgiveness. And I think that's why some people are waiting right now to see, it's another consideration for a policy change on the PPP program. But right now, as it currently stands, your idle advance would be considered and reduce your amount of forgiveness. If I need to elaborate or repeat on any of that, I'd be happy to.
That's great. I'm watching our chat to see if we've got any specific questions to the idle. I find the idle piece confusing, and from a standpoint of pretty good knowledge of the programs, but one point you did make was the understanding that the SBA program itself is a national program. It's not specific to Minnesota. That the idle loans were put in place for other disasters that may have occurred on a national scale outside of the COVID or the civil unrest that we've experienced in our market. So you mentioned the date of April 3rd as the date. If there's an idle loan prior to April 3rd, then we need to put it into consideration. The idle loans that our businesses here in Minnesota and in our market may have received as additional help, those would be treated separately, if I'm understanding correctly.
Yeah, so it's confusing because idle existed before the CARES Act. It was an existing SBA program that we administered for disasters. And so that was always an existing program, and that's why we were able to roll it out so quickly at the beginning of the COVID crisis. And then the CARES Act was passed on March 27th, and that changed our idle program to add in that advance grant portion that didn't exist before. So what I was talking about with affecting forgiveness is only that grant portion. The idle loan itself doesn't affect PPP. It's only that idle advance or that idle grant portion made available under the CARES Act that would affect your PPP forgiveness.
Thank you. That's great. Brian, I've got a question from one of our attendees. Business owners were encouraged to apply for PPP, and some were fortunate to have not had to touch the funds. Aside from saying congratulations, your business did pretty well during this time, what recommendation do we have to those business owners? Do they have an opportunity to request forgiveness? Is it, what should they do with the money?
Yeah, so I think that obviously there's 24 weeks after you received it to use it for payroll. So if you're able to use, and I saw there was a question in the chat, what if you use 100% for payroll? Well, then that's a slam dunk for full forgiveness, right? So the PPP loan would be fully forgiven as long as you use at least 60% for payroll, right? So that's really the big line for forgiveness with PPP. I think that Kevin made a great point that we have some really great trusted partners who can provide really great, because of course the answer to that question depends on specific situations. I think SCORE was mentioned. I know Women Venture is on the line. The Small Business Development Center. There's a lot of great trusted partners that can provide you that confidential one-on-one consulting to really make the best choice given your individual circumstances. But I think there's a couple options that would be available. You could return the funds, right? That's my understanding, Chris. There would be no prepayment penalty if you just wanted to return the PPP, pay it off early. That's certainly an option that's available to you. Or you can try to figure out a way to make the most of it. And I think, most of us are really affected by COVID in one way or the other. And so to look at how can you conserve your cash during this time is really critical, and how can you put it to best use, and perhaps using that money within that 24-week window for payroll, so then it's fully forgiven.
Great, thank you. Thanks for answering that. I've got a question. You mentioned the CARES Act, Brian, and one of the components of the CARES Act allowed for the SBA to make payments directly to the bank for existing SBA loans, up to 6 payments. That started, most of those borrowers are coming to the end of that 6-payment window. And actually, I've got 2 questions. Do you think we'll see an extension of that, the CARES Act allowing or offering the SBA making those payments for existing SBA borrowers? And the second piece is, currently, loans that close and fund before September 27th, which is a Sunday, so in banking world, it'd have to be the 25th, Friday, those loans would be eligible for the 6 months of payments by the SBA.
Correct.
I've heard talk that may be extended. Anything you can share on that?
Yeah, no, nothing that I can share in terms of it being extended. I think I'm glad that you brought that up, because I think that's definitely something. We're talking about the debt relief under the CARES Act. And so for anyone that had an existing SBA 7A, 504, or microloan, SBA made payments on your behalf for 6 months, principal and interest. So that was a really great program under the CARES Act. And then, like Chris mentioned, there's a deadline. You can get this 6 months debt relief up until September 27th. Really, that deadline is only good for 7A and microloans at this point, because of some of the advanced scheduling for the debentures that have to go into place for 504. So the deadline is already passed for a new 504 loan. But I think it's certainly it's a $1 million question, and there are those funds remaining right now from PPP. So I think it's just kind of we'll see what happens with repurposing. Perhaps some of the funds could be repurposed for debt relief. I personally haven't heard as much about extending debt relief as I've heard of proposals for repurposing PPP or opening PPP back up for a second round. Personally, I haven't heard that much conversation on debt relief.
Great, thank you, Brian. I'm not seeing any other questions in chat. I'm wondering, please, if there's anything you'd like to know, you've got a wonderful opportunity to ask Brian directly from the SBA his thoughts. This is a great opportunity for us. Please type those in and we'll watch for those. At this point, Kevin, do you have any comments? That we're about 10 minutes, coming up on 10 minutes to our time. Kevin, do you have any comments, parting comments, or any?
I have a couple of questions to bounce off, Brian.
Sure.
You said there's roughly 130 billion of funds still in escrow that haven't been loaned out. I know you said it at the beginning, but how much roughly was loaned out?
I would have to look that.
Okay.
I would have to look that up. So I think we had, was it 310 billion under the first round and 349 billion under the second round?
Roughly.
So if we do the math there, add those two up and then subtract 130 billion. So it was over 500 billion that went out. So yeah, I mean, it was really a remarkable effort by the lending community to get that out. And I know there was, we spent a lot of nights and weekends troubleshooting and working with Paul, Chris, and your team. And I think we've heard a lot of testaments about how helpful it was. So now I think we're at a point where obviously that the forgiveness part is critical, and that's why we're here today. And then obviously what's going to happen with that remaining amount of money. And it's a lot of money that can be put to good use for our community. So we're hoping for some action pretty soon so that, SBA can administer that.
And can you give us an idea, roughly, once a person applies for the loan forgiveness, how much turnaround time is there when they finally do find out that it's been forgiven and approved for forgiveness, roughly?
Yeah, so it's, you submit it to your lender. The lender has up to 60 days to then submit it to SBA.
Okay.
And then SBA has up to 90 days after the lender submits it to us. And then we remit that payment directly to the lender. So, there is a bit of a process. We're right at the beginning stages of it. And I think the expectation is that it'll, hopefully move pretty quickly, just like PPP did, just getting the funds out the door.
Okay. And are there any specific audit requirements that businesses have to be concerned with, or is it only larger businesses that have to be concerned with that?
That's a great question.
Yeah, and that's kind of I'm a little bit removed from that. But I think, I probably know the same information that you do. There was a lot of money made available. I don't remember off the top of my head for our audits and our Office of Inspector General. And, but it was, millions of dollars made available to add on additional staff. I worked in DC during the Recovery Act, and I can just say that there was a huge emphasis on oversight for the funds back in, 09 and 10. And then a couple years following up on it. And I think based on the funding made available under the CARES Act, it's at that level, if not more. There is a box on the application that folks check for PPP if they received PPP over 2 million. So I think there's definitely greater scrutiny on PPP loans over 2 million.
I didn't have any
And
other.
if I understand correctly also, Brian, that the SBA is not shutting the door on being able to review any loan of any size, but that $2 million benchmark is the one where borrowers should anticipate there'll be more scrutiny.
Correct.
Right, okay. I've got a question here asking us to explain the repayment terms for the portion that does not get forgiven.
So the repayment terms, you would definitely default back to the agreement that you have with your lender. And so depending on if you got the loan before that Paycheck Protection Flexibility Act was passed, you might have a 2-year loan or you might have a 5-year loan. It's kind of depends on the timing on when you received your PPP loan. So, so for any, let's say that you had a $100,000 PPP loan and $90,000 was forgiven and you had that $10,000 left over, it's going to be at 1% interest, and then it could either be for 2 years or 5 years. And of course, there's no prepayment penalty, so you could pay it off, in full at any time, or you could stretch it out for the term that you have with the lender. Chris,
Brian,
I don't know
do I understand correctly that we've got the option for those loans that would have originated pre-June 5th, I believe was the date, that the lender and the borrower can agree to move it to that 5-year repayment period. Those loans would have fallen under the 24 months, but we can have mutual agreement between lender borrower to go the longer 5-year period.
Exactly. So it just has to be mutually agreed upon. So that's why you want to make sure you have that in writing from your lender, that it's agreed upon. You have it in a promissory note or whatever the agreement is that you have with your lender on this PPP loan. But you can go back to them and say, hey, we have it for 2 years. My understanding is, it's possible to have it be 5 years, and it's worth seeing if you can do that if you want.
Great, great. Well, at this point, we're coming up at about 5 minutes. Kevin, I'd like to ask you for some final comments.
Sure, I guess I'd like to just reiterate some of the resources. SBA.gov has the most extensive and is probably the best resource for information about applying for the loan forgiveness. And then also there's some treasury.gov information, but really SBA.gov is the go-to resource for information. So I guess I'd recommend everybody just, proceed with trying to complete and actually do the loan forgiveness application as soon as possible, which I think makes sense, and then kind of gets that wrapped up sooner better than later. Tendency to put things off just makes it maybe a little more complicated sometimes anyway. So to the extent that you meet the qualifications now, I'd go ahead and start that process and apply for the forgiveness as soon as you can. And that's really all I had.
Thank you, Kevin. We appreciate your taking time to be with us this morning. And Kevin's information we will make available after the meeting through the chamber. So, and Brian, parting thoughts, words?
Yes, thanks. So yeah, thank you so much, Chris and Kevin. And I think the recurring theme today was to stay in touch and keep those lines of communication open with your lender and your trusted partners, your CPA like Kevin, or your other trusted partners, SBA partners like SCORE, Women Venture, the Small Business Development Center. I think to take a look at enhanced debt relief that Chris mentioned. So that's 6 months. The deadline for that is September 27th. So you would go to your SBA lender and can talk to them about additional funds for expansion and working capital. So, and then I think just making sure to gather your documents again, talk with your lender. You have 10 months to submit this. I just want to say that if you're on this call, then you truly care, and I think you're ahead of the curve. And take a deep breath as you're going through this. Our team is doing a bunch of trainings. We have weekly calls where you can get on with our staff to ask any questions, and those are live webinars that we host. And then I posted our office contact information as well. So if you just wanted kind of that added layer of reassurance, it's completely understandable. And I think hopefully you have that. You feel a little bit more assured today. And just want to thank Chad and the Midway Chamber for the opportunity to be here today. And we just look forward to the opportunity to come back in the future and to help folks with our programs for growing, expanding, and recovering your business. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. I appreciate your taking out a portion of your data here, the updates on PPP. Thank you, Chad, for putting together this panel. Again, thank you, Kevin and Brian, for your time. And with that, I'll toss it back to you, Chad, for closing comments.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And again, this is recorded, so we will send the link out to everybody later along with the slides. For the rest of September, we're going to do events either virtually or outside. We're going to have a lunch on the line at Cafe Biagio tomorrow. And I'll include this information on the email, but we're going to have a meeting for parents where they can talk about what the school year is going to bring for them and bounce ideas off each other and perhaps vent a little bit on September 17th. September 22nd, we're kicking off our economic development virtual meetings again, where we will be talking about the recovery efforts in the Midway. We also will have a walking tour and then end at Lake Monster Brewing. And then September 30th, we are going to be doing a Marketing and Tech 101 virtual meeting. So some programming coming up. Look for more information on that soon. Thanks everybody for joining us. Have a good day.
Thank you.